Well, hello everybody, and welcome to this talk about the book, The Alien Cell Hypothesis, An Exodus to Freedom and Human Flourishing, written by me, Andy Oakley. When people ask me about my book, I tell them that it's about the entire history of the universe, encompassing everything that has ever happened in the past and everything that will happen in the future. Let me tell you, trying to covering all of that in less than 60 minutes is going to be quite a journey, so hold on to your hats. Actually, in the book, to make the journey possible, I created something called TACHEE, T-A-C-H-E-E, which is an acronym for the Alien Cell Hypothesis of Experimentation and Exploring. As this hypothesis revolves around the continuing process of experimentation and exploring that are inherent in every cell of biology. You see, biology comes from the Greek word bio, meaning life, and logos, meaning study or knowledge. And any study of life must include the exploration of identity. In fact, all of my books, including this new one, are really about identity. And identity refers to the fact of being who or what a person or a thing is. Here in this video, all the people watching are humans, human beings, and that makes us incredibly special. However, due to our diminishing understanding of this fundamental fact, we've become vulnerable to corruption. And this corruption manifests itself in the form of governmental and corporatized coercion, which has nothing to do with human flourishing and everything to do with establishing systems of central or global control. Now, when I talk about corruption in this context, I'm not necessarily referring to orchestrated evil or illegal activities carried out by a specific group. Instead, I mean a corruption as in a computer program producing nonsensical results because it lacks the correct inputs. In my first book, I challenged our government's approach to identity by highlighting a singular identity they impose through legislation. In my view, they incorrectly assigned the unified identity, Māori, to all the distinct groups, tribes and iwi that had arrived in New Zealand over hundreds and possibly thousands of years. And by doing so, these individuals were suddenly seen as having a different identity than other New Zealanders. The government has legislated that they belong to a separate race. And the government are progressively granting this distinct group additional and different rights compared to every other New Zealander. In recognising the various groups that arrived in New Zealand at different times and lived separately, they disregarded the arrival of any other group with white skin, considering them mere colonisers. This dismissal occurs despite the fact that historically, as each group arrived in New Zealand, larger groups would colonise or eliminate the smaller ones. Colonisation not only occurred before any European arrived here, colonisation is the history of the entire earth. So I challenged the government by submitting a treaty claim to the Waitangi Tribunal in 2013. In that claim, I presented 22 different definitions of how I identified as a Maori. I argued that by breaching Article 3 of the treaty, which guarantees equal rights for all New Zealanders, they were discriminating against me. Unsurprisingly, none of my definitions were accepted, and they requested that I prove my Maori identity, something that I believe no one else is required to do in their treaty claims. I responded to them by letter, expressing my willingness to provide proof. However, since they had previously disregarded all of my definitions, I asked them to provide their own definition of what constitutes a Maori. And once I had that definition, I would happily demonstrate to them that I fit the criteria. Again, unsurprisingly, they never replied to my letter, despite numerous letters from me reminding them that I was waiting for their definition. 9 years passed, and they eventually sent me a letter stating that because I had failed to prove my Maori identity, the claim was closed. It's astounding that even the Waitangi Tribunal, who should be the experts in this matter, were unable to define what a person of the Maori race is. although they knew who was not considered one. They just kept their methods of defining race to themselves. And I suspect they might be utilising the racially discriminatory one-drop rule, similar to what was used to identify African Americans in the United States during the Jim Crow era. This is a wonderful tool for governments to be using, isn't it? Operating under the Ministry of Justice, the Waitangi Tribunal's actions exemplify government corruption. Although they have not been granted any authority to define people's race, they do it anyway. In my second book, which Once We Were One, which was written as if it were a court case, just in case there was one, I revealed through historical evidence that in 1840, when the treaty was signed, there was no collective group known as Māori in New Zealand. The social construct of Māori, which unifies the 600 or so separate tribes into one people and applies the noun Māori to them, didn't exist in New Zealand's history until well after the signing of the treaty. Consequently, the noun Māori did not exist in 1840, and so you won't find that noun on any of the 1840 treaty documents. In the 1840 documents, the word Māori is written with a small m, and it's used as an adjective, meaning ordinary, or lower in rank compared to something higher, such as tangata Māori, meaning ordinary people, as opposed to a higher rank, rangatira, which is a chief. The fact that the government uses the word Māori as a noun in legislation, claiming it was a noun in the treaty, is nothing short of fraud. And because I have pointed this out in my book, the government occasionally resorts to denigrating my books and me on national TV and other forms of mass media. Now, let's talk about my latest book. With regards to this corruption, I couldn't help but notice that the kind of government corruption and polarisation that I've written about was also prevalent in many other Western countries. I observed that the political systems and democratic processes in the West were increasingly not focused on promoting human flourishing, which should be the primary goal of your government, shouldn't it? If you live in a country where you are not allowed to express certain opinions, as is the case in our country and many others, whether it's about government corruption, government overreach, concerns regarding vaccinations, or aspects of the country's history, it's an objective fact that you are living in a tyranny. Free speech was lost in New Zealand quite some time ago, and since the release of my first book in 2014, I believe we've witnessed the rise of tyranny in our nation. In analysing what is happening, it became clear to me whatever promises political parties make during election campaigns, either no progress is made at all, or the opposite occurs. For example, efforts to combat child poverty only result in higher child poverty rates. Attempts to address the housing crisis only lead to a bigger crisis. Initiatives to improve our health statistics result in the highest all-cause mortality rates we've seen in decades. These issues are not limited to deficiencies on either the left or the right of the political spectrum, nor are they the fault of a single leader. The problems persist regardless of who's in power, and with changes in the government occurring more frequently, weekly or monthly sometimes in Britain, things continue to worsen. And when it comes to building productive and sustainable societies, there are three crucial areas that a government must address for the well-being of its nation. An economy that provides for its people, a healthcare system that prevents illness and cares for the sick, and an education system that prepares resilient young adults for entry into a productive and sustainable society. Now, some may argue that the provisions of secure and sustainable energy sources should also be included, and I agree. However, for the sake of focusing on the main points of this talk, I'll leave energy out of this discussion. In my view, a sustainable society is one that is not polarised by government-induced fear or constant reminders from the mainstream media about the supposed oppression of various recently made-up identity groups. Now, if you're sick of this stuff, my advice to you is to turn off mainstream media and ignore almost everything politicians say. Until your life becomes so much more pleasant. A sustainable society is one where people do not constantly worry about where their next dollar is coming from. The government should and can establish an economic system where people are productive and feel a sense of belonging. Instead, people are consistently reminded not only of their personal debts, but also of the government debt, which allegedly hinders a healthy economy. The blame for this government debt is placed either on either the blue team or the red team or any team except their own team. Furthermore, I'd argue that a sustainable society is one which children are taught how, when, and what to eat from a young age, along with the consequences of not following these basic biological rules. Failing to eat properly leads to obesity, depression, anxiety, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, organ failure, including heart problems. Increasingly, these outcomes also align with the consequences of relying on pharmaceuticals prescribed when one doesn't adhere to the principles of proper nutrition. Those who remember life before the 1970s will recall the shape and weight of humans beings were very different compared to what we see today. It is evident in New Zealand and much of the Western civilization that since the mid-70s, no government has made any positive impacts in these crucial areas. Economics. The neoclassical theory of economics, which is currently taught and applied by most Western governments through universities, has proven to be a failure. Health. Our health system is marked by long-term pain, suffering, and unnecessary deaths, as it has been corrupted by fake science and big pharmaceutical companies. Education. Our public education systems have openly embraced the Marxist-based critical theory model as the foundation of education in New Zealand and many other Western countries. We are facing a crisis. There is not a single political party in any country that presents a new vision, a coherent philosophy, or comprehensive plan to address this crisis. Moreover, there seems to be little appetite among the public for a new vision, philosophy, or plan. And I would argue that the citizens have been conditioned to rely solely on the government, which constantly tells them that they need vaccines, pills, protections, and loans that only governments can provide. This reliance on the government has effectively extinguished any vision for the future. Given that our current political and democratic systems are failing to deliver human flourishing, and few people are willing to break away from the status quo, the only foreseeable outcome is the gradual collapse of Western civilization. We find ourselves trapped in a negative loop that perpetuates the status quo, despite the obvious fact that the status quo will ultimately be our downfall. Although the core issues lie in the capture of these big three sectors, education, economics, and health, and their interconnectedness, for the purposes of this discussion, I will emphasize that no Western government truly understands how to utilize a fiat currency economy to foster human flourishing. Instead, the economy has been geared towards empowering corporations such as Nestle and PepsiCo in the food industry, Fisher Healthcare and Pfizer in pharmaceuticals, Apple and Meta, Facebook in the realm of technology. In the current flawed economic system, money injected into the economy by the government tends to flow in one direction, towards these corporations. Consequently, they amass enormous wealth and power. With their influence, they generate fabricated, peer-reviewed scientific studies that promote the supposed benefits of their products. They eliminate competition through acquisitions, and they exert their control over the government and opposition parties that may hold seats in the government. These corporate giants also collaborate with mass media outlets and global organizations like the UN, WEF, IMF, and the World Health Organization. Together with captured governments, these entities exercise complete control over the crucial sectors of education, economics, and health. They have the ability to induce pandemics, sow divisions among nations by introducing critical theory into education systems, and perpetuate confusion about economics by perpetuating the obviously flawed neoclassical economic teachings in universities. Despite it being 2023, welcome to George Orwell's 1984. Did anyone notice the debilitating top-down coercion during the COVID-19 pandemic? This was the pandemic where the whole country was locked up and waiting for a vaccine that neither prevented you catching or passing on the virus. Due to the political influence wielded by corporations and globalists, young people especially are deliberately denied opportunities to understand how the world truly operates. And as a result, the younger generation perceive the world through a vastly different lens compared to older, wiser individuals who remember life before this dystopian era. We have reached a point where the youth are reluctant to start families. They're confused about their sexuality, they harbour disdain for humanity, and they attribute blame to old cis white men for all of society's problems. Our history has been altered. Genuine economic education is suppressed. Even discussing healthy eating becomes controversial due to fat-shaming concerns. And education is engineered to produce weak-minded young adults who struggle to distinguish basic differences between men and women. This is the consequence of getting economics wrong. Civilization collapses and we find ourselves adrift without a clear sense of our identity or purpose. God is dead, proclaimed philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Throughout my adult life, I've identified as an atheist, or at the very least agnostic. However, considering the lack of consent and rationality among the governed, I mean us as opposed to the government, I believe that something is missing in our civilization. Reflecting on this, I had an epiphany that led me to develop a hypothesis, and that was the idea that gave birth to this book. I call it the alien cell hypothesis of experimentation and exploration, or TACHE, T-A-C-H-E-E. In this short talk, I cannot fully do justice to the hypothesis. However, I will share that it draws upon the theories of Nobel Prize-winning laureates and esteemed physicists and polymaths, including Aristotle, to piece together our understanding of human beings and our role within the biological tapestry of life on Earth, potentially beyond. It seeks to unveil meaning and purpose, if you will. The hypothesis aligns perfectly with the title of my second book, Once We Were One, The Fraud of Modern Separatism. It explores the scientific fact that all life on Earth shares a common ancestor known as LUCA, or the last universal common ancestor. LUCA is believed to have been a self-replicating cell, similar to bacteria. Interestingly, very similar bacteria to the first known cell still exists within our gut, our microbiome. We harbour trillions of these bacteria within our bodies. And today, we understand that the microbiome, where the bacteria is, can be considered an organ roughly the size of the average human brain. And it profoundly impacts our perception of the world and the functionings of our body's organs. When we prioritize the fortification of our microbiomes through proper nutrition, we can significantly reduce the need for external pharmaceutical intervention. In essence, our microbiome acts as an onboard pharmaceutical factory, continuously producing chemicals to regulate and to protect our bodies from pathogens. Moreover, our gut microbiome plays a critical role in regulating our immune system. However, big food, big pharma, the World Health Organization, and the governments actively discourage the understanding of this science. To the same extent that my ideas about identity are being cancelled by the government, anyone who dares speak up about vaccines or challenge the notion that cancer is solely a genetic disease, but rather a metabolic one, will face similar consequences: cancellation. Corporations have been consumed by psychosis of power. They manipulate governments, politicians, and institutes to adopt similar psychosis. Allow me to demonstrate the sheer madness of these entities and their blatant disregard for human flourishing. Let's take a moment to delve into the subject of economics, and don't worry, it's not as mind-numbingly complicated and boring as you might think. As I mentioned earlier, the prevailing economic theory employed by Western governments is known as neoclassical economics. In simple terms, there is commerce, money circulating in various commercial activities, and the government taxes individuals and businesses to fund infrastructure development and to ensure their protection of people and our borders. While this is a simplified explanation, it captures the essence of what is happening. I'm sure everybody can grasp the basic concept. Back in the 1960s in New Zealand, a single working man could support an entire family. With that sole income, they could take advantage of something that was called the family benefit and purchase a house. Back then, our home ownership rates was around 70%. Mothers had the options to stay at home and nurture their 3 or 4 children, and New Zealand was one of the most productive countries per capita. We also boasted some of the lowest crime and suicide rates in the world. Fast forward to today, and despite most couples now working, home ownership has declined to around 50%, and we're one of the least productive countries in the Western world. Crime rates are high, and our suicide statistics are among the worst in the West. Clearly, obviously, something is amiss. Yet we are so consumed by identity politics and subjected to top-down coercion that we have few opportunities to question these issues. The media, who are often compromised by corporate interests, certainly don't want to do it. And should a member of the public dare to speak up, they are met with accusations of hate speech and promptly cancelled. Now, let's consider Clause 26G of the Public Finance Act in New Zealand legislation. Essentially, it states that a government must exercise fiscal responsibility and avoid spending more than it collects in tax revenue. If a government does spend beyond its means, it must justify why and outline a plan to restore equilibrium. This is the same in most Western countries. Now, believe it or not, that clause is utter nonsense. Just like the clause in the Treaty of Waitangi Act that defines Māori as a member of the Māori race, a concept that has no definition. Governments do not rely on taxes from individuals and businesses to initiate tenders and to build infrastructure. Sure, if you've been taught that these falsehoods are absolute truths, for instance, that Māori are a distinct human category and that governments do depend on taxes for functioning, most people will believe them. However, just because something is taught does not make it true or accurate. Allow me to elaborate. All Western countries operate with what's known as the fiat currency. And the term fiat refers to an authoritative order or decree that is expected to be unquestionably followed. In the legislation of each fiat currency operating country, you will find that only the government has the authority to issue the sovereign currency, and they can do so at their discretion. We have to forget that they've convinced themselves that they can't. After all, this is one of the main tools oppositions use to denigrate the current government, i.e. that they were fiscally irresponsible. Let's take a concrete example to illustrate this point. Suppose the government decides to construct a large-scale hospital. They can simply request consultants to provide a budget, obtain approval from the Treasury for the expenditure, call for tenders and award the contract to a reputable New Zealand-based company that pays good wages to its employees. There is no physical room full of cash extracted from individuals and businesses that they need to dig into. It all boils down to digits on a spreadsheet. When you pay taxes, the government simply reduces the digits on your account and increases the digits in the Reserve Bank. Similarly, when the bank extends credit, essentially bringing future money forward, they do not require reserves to do so. This is a factual reality. It's crucial to understand that governments, as currency issuers, do not face the same constraints as individuals and business who are currency users within the economy. So one is a currency issuer into the economy and one is a currency user within the economy. That's the difference. However, just because the government has the ability to issue currency at will, it doesn't mean it should do so indiscriminately. What I'm presenting to you is an alternative monetary theory known as modern monetary theory, or MMT. MMT is simply a framework for describing how the current economy operates. It's not a new one. It doesn't propose the need for additional institutions beyond what we already have. It offers a perspective that allows us to design an economy that caters to the well-being of people, promoting human flourishing, if you will. MMT is an economic framework that challenges some of the traditional beliefs about money and government spending. And that's why when you challenge them, they will cancel you out. Here's an explanation in simple terms. Let's first talk about currency issuance. MMT recognizes that governments, as currency issuers, have the power to create and issue money, unlike individuals or businesses which rely on earning or borrowing money. Governments can create money by simply adding digits to their account, and that is how they do it. Let's talk about taxes and spending. MMT emphasises that taxes do not fund government spending in the same way individuals fund their expenses. Instead, taxes serve other purposes such as controlling inflation, redistributing wealth, incentivising or discouraging certain behaviours such as taxing cigarettes, for instance. When the government collects the taxes, it effectively reduces the amount of money in the economy. So it can pour money in and it can take it out through taxes. This is what I was saying earlier. The government issue money into the economy. It moves about as goods and services take place, tax being extracted at each transaction, supposedly allowing governments to spend it back in. Can you imagine at the football stadium that the ticket issuer would have to collect all the tickets to reissue to them as each game took place? Of course they don't. Like money, the value is in the goods and services that is provided, not in the money or the ticket itself. Rather astonishingly, our economic leaders can't even figure that out. Okay, let's talk about spending and deficits. MMT argues that government deficits, when spending exceeds tax revenue, are not inherently bad. In fact, deficits can be necessary to stimulate economic growth and ensure full employment. Governments can safely run deficits as long as there's productive capacity available in the economy to absorb the increased spending. This is one of the reasons why we need to be productive instead of buying everything from overseas. Next, we'll talk about the role of central banks. MMT recognises that the central banks, like our Reserve Bank, have the authority to create money and set interest rates. They can work in coordination with fiscal policy, government spending and taxation to influence the overall economy. Generally, tax should be very low. They are only required to bind the people and the government in a fiduciary relationship. In other words, if you have to pay tax, you will use the sovereign currency. Inflation control. MMT emphasises the importance of monitoring and managing inflation. If government spending exceeds the productive capacity of the economy, it can lead to excessive inflation. In such cases, taxes can be used to reduce the money supply and control the inflationary pressures. Overall, MMT suggests that government should focus on promoting full employment and productive use of all available resources, which is what the New Zealand government were better at 5 or 6 decades ago, rather than being overly concerned about balancing budgets. By understanding their role as currency issuers, governments can effectively use fiscal monetary policies to achieve economic stability and improve the well-being of their citizens. Ladies and gentlemen, when we consider the ideas of modern monetary theory and the profound impact it could have on our societies, it becomes evident why it has struggled to gain widespread recognition. The truth is that the solution to our government and corporate psychosis lies within the principles of MMT, and those in power will stop at nothing to prevent this knowledge from reaching the masses. As I mentioned earlier, taxes are not essential for government spending. Their purpose is to remove excess money from the economy. The fact that corporations can accumulate such vast amounts of wealth and establish monopolies is a clear sign that there is an imbalance in the economy. However, they use a fraction of their wealth to buy up their competition, reserving the real power and influence for political control over the masses. Although I cannot present the exact tax laws today, it is entirely possible to reshape our tax system to prevent corporate dominance. For far too long, our governments have convinced us that they must take a significant portion of our income through taxes, which has always been unnecessary and has resulted in immense suffering and loss of life. And at the same time, these tax laws have allowed corporations to undermine our entire civilization. I propose that this corruption in the Western world has caused more death and suffering than all world wars and natural disasters of the 20th and 21st centuries combined. When we add to this economic tragedy the indoctrination and confusion inflicted upon multiple generations of children, we start to grasp the gravity of the situation. And it is the gravity of the situation that led me to contemplate our true nature as humans and our purpose in life. We are intricate collections of cells guided by a divine force. That force is undefined. Our purpose is to create sustainable societies that allow the human cell to venture out into the universe. This fundamental drive for experimentation and exploration resides within every cell of our bodies and in every biological cell that constitutes all forms of life. This is why the achievement of landing on another celestial body was hailed as one of humanity's greatest accomplishments. It is why we continue to push the boundaries and explore deeper into the vast expanse of the universe. The origins of the first cell remain a subject of debate between religion and science, a debate that perhaps does not require a definitive answer. Regardless of where the cell originated, it does not alter the fundamental process that we are all part of. Renowned Nobel Prize-winning physicist Sir Roger Penrose proposes that the universe operates in cycles, with time and space collapsing into a singularity roughly every 36 billion years. From that singularity, a new cycle of expansion begins, akin to the rhythm of a beating heart. As the ventricles fill, an electrical charge initiates a new pulse. It seems that God, undefined, has created mankind in his own image. And I think many people will recognize that idea from a popular book that's been out for a while. We, as humans, are composed of cells, and each cell is more intricate and complex than any scientist can fathom. Every breakthrough in understanding the workings of the cell only reveals how much more there is to learn. And considering this, the notion of using lipid nanoparticles to directly inject mRNA into our cells is a grave mistake and must be outlawed immediately. Instead, we should focus on simple measures like proper nutrition and exposure to sunlight, which can provide better protection against viruses than any pharmaceutical intervention. By insisting that our institutions drop the peer review system that has become corrupted by fake science and a profoundly stupid economic philosophy, we can allow humans to once again flourish. By having an economy where the people have enough money and are productive, the desperate striving to have a larger slice of an ever-shrinking pie will ease. The focus on material things will become less important and our relationships will improve. Ladies and gentlemen, it's high time for our humanity to awaken to these realities and embrace the profound interconnectedness of our existence. By understanding our role as stewards of life and agents of exploration, we can forge a path towards a more enlightened and prosperous future. Thank you. The book, The Alien Cell Hypothesis, is available on Amazon for the ridiculous price of $3.99. I thank you for your attention today.